Sup, my fellas, don't forget to leave feedback and enjoy the story. Be able to test himself in this matter since he was instructing him to do it. Jang stood up from the sofa with a joyful expression on his face and clenched his fists, realizing that he would start preparing right now. Lu Lai looked ahead at the guys, noting that he could begin the task. Peng looked at Jang, who gave him a malicious grin. Jang ironically joked with Peng, telling him to behave and when he returns, he will bring him tangerines. Peng looked at Jang with contempt and told him that Jang should wipe his snot and be careful on the stairs because there you could fall to your death. Jang left the office and the door slammed. Peng leaned forward slightly and crossed his arms, resting them on his knees. He called Jang an idiot. At that same second, the main character turned to him for Peng to come to him. Peng crossed his arms behind him and walked towards Lu Lai, who was sitting on the sofa. Lu Lai asked Peng if he was familiar with the Falcon Squad's training. Peng knitted his eyebrows a little and looked down at his boss. He replied that he carefully watched instructor Jang's every move and also took notes. The main character looked at Peng with a grin, who was slightly scared. Lu Lai's boss asked him if Peng was confident that he could regroup the squad and make it more secretive. Lu Lai looked at his assistant with intolerance. Lu Lai added that he needed to make this unit more secretive. Peng still didn't understand how he would do this, so he looked confused. At the same moment he frowned deeply and said that he would do everything. Peng stood away from his boss, who crossed his arms and legs. Peng reassured his boss by telling him that he could be relied upon. Robert looked out from his seat and addressed his boss. When Lu Lai cast his disdainful glance at him, Robert said he should interrupt his boss so he could see something. Robert started tapping his fingers on the computer to display information through the projector. Lu Lai looked unhappy and rested one hand on the back of the sofa. He asked what was interesting about Robert. Robert looked at his boss with admiration and anticipation in his eyes. He said that according to the global talent base, a first-class environmental expert has been found in Dong province. It was an elderly man wearing a white t-shirt and holding a lollipop. His name was Hu Gaoming and he was 89 years old. Chinese phytoecologist, one of the founders of phytocology and geobotany in China. Last year, he studied the relationship between plants and soil based on extensive research. He put forward his point of view on the zoning of vegetation and proposed his classification of complex plants. The silhouette of the scientist was on a blue background of cells in a neurobiological chain. This famous geobotanist, Shukalsky, based on this approach, became an outstanding representative of the scientific school of the soil ecosystem. With a glowing and joyful look, Lu Lai jumped up and looked at Robert. Robert looked at his boss with a malicious grin. He noticed that it was this person that Lu Lai was looking for in order to study environmental problems. Gaoming closed his eyes and bared his teeth sarcastically, making an excellent sign with a gesture. Robert added that this Gaoming was not inferior to Mr. Tang at all. Lu Lai looked forward in anticipation and amazement as Robert looked back at him with a malicious smile. Robert said it was level 10. Lu Lai was watching the Gaoming live broadcast on his phone, holding the phone in his hands. On this broadcast there was a chat with subscribers, to whom Gaoming told about a video that stated not about real peanuts, but about a plant called an Angelina. During the live broadcast, Gaoming was a little confused when someone from the side distracted him. Gaoming noted that students should trust science and suggested immediately banning those accounts created for the sake of marketing. Peng looked at Lu Lai's phone in bewilderment, where they were watching the Gaoming live broadcast together. Lu Lai looked at his phone with a grin. Everything on his phone lit up with a bright light. The main character stood up from the sofa and straightened his shoulders proudly. On a warm summer day, the park was light and fresh. Gaoming walked through the park with his phone and continued filming with it. Gaoming walked past other people in the park who were sitting quietly on a bench. Gaoming walked among small bushes and a few dense trees. Gaoming wondered if they would find treasure here. Suddenly, Gaoming turned back and saw a large beetle crawling on the village. Gaoming noted that it was a cicada that would shed its shell very soon. Gaoming continued to film and pointed his phone towards the beetle. Gaoming broadcast live and talked about how cicadas spend several years underground and then climb trees and molt. He also added that few people knew or paid attention to the detailed process of transformation of cicadas. Gaoming sat quietly and calmly by the tree and filmed what was happening. He invited his viewers to watch this rare and unique process. He also provoked subscribers to like him by telling them that they would get rich. Gaoming looked at his phone with interest and curiosity. He said that it takes a cicada about an hour to completely get rid of its shell, and this process is fascinating every time because nature has given a great gift to humanity. Two black silhouettes appeared in the park. It was Tang and Lu Lai who were watching Gaoming closely. Tang said with a malicious grin that Mr. Gaoming was difficult to distinguish from a child. In response to this, Lu Lai just laughed. The main character looked ahead sarcastically and broke into a smile. He thought that to create a new world they needed such pure and enthusiastic people. The protagonist covered his malicious face with his hand and took out his gold time watch. He was going to show Mr. Gaoming real miracles. A dome of temporary acceleration appeared around the cicada. After a couple of moments, she began to crawl out of her previous body. She then completely revamped her current appearance. Gaoming dropped the selfie stick along with their phones. The elderly man jumped back and fell to the ground. His eyes narrowed and shock and sweat began to run down his forehead. He exclaimed that it was simply incredible that the cicada had shed its shell in an instant. Looking in that direction with shocked eyes, he wondered if it could be some new species, and then he himself refuted his words, saying that it was simply impossible. Gaoming jerked and turned around when asked to relax. Tang in a blue suit approached him, holding his hands behind his back, and smiled. He told the older man that he was no longer old enough to fall like that. Gaoming looked back at him with puzzled eyes, asking who he was. Squinting his eyes, Tang grinned when he heard the words that he seemed very familiar. With his eyes wide open, the old man peered into the face of the unknown, noting that he looked like Tang Jiorui. He was definitely not him. He asked if he was his relative. A man in black patent leather shoes walked towards them from the side, asking that if cicadas are able to transform, then why can't people? Continuing to walk, Lu Lai put his hands in the pockets of his checkered coat and closed his eyes. Tang furrowed his gray eyebrows when the guy said that he believed that all living things could live forever. Hearing these words, a stupor appeared on Gaoming's face and he indignantly asked whether his haters had really sent them. Looking into his eyes, the guy asked to look at the cicada again, saying that then he himself would understand everything. The elderly man turned around sharply. Smirking at the corners of his lips, Lu Lai raised his palm and activated a 100-fold slowdown. A dark curtain appeared again around the cicada. The old man screamed loudly when a powerful stream of wind hit his face. The young man grinned, and Tang cast a mysterious glance in his direction. Gaoming's eyes widened in shock as the cicada on the tree returned to its previous state and asked how did this happen. He turned sharply towards two people unknown to him, and his wig flew to the side. He exclaimed that this was simply impossible. Closing his eyes, Lu Lai lowered his head and touched his glasses with his hands. He noted that these were just trifles. Squinting his eyes, the old man cast an incredulous glance in his direction and noted that he had never seen anything like this in his entire life. He asked who he was. Looking at the elderly man with a slight smirk on his lips, Lu Lai noted that he could call him Mr. Lu and then said that he was. Gaoming was shocked and Tang smiled contentedly when the guy said that he was a time trader. The half-bald old man looked at him with blank eyes, asking whether it was really possible to buy and sell time, and then in what form it was sold and in what units it was measured. A drop of sweat began to flow down Lu Lai's cheek as the scientist touched his chin and lowered his eyes, noting that this was from the realm of physical units. He added that he first needed to think carefully. The guy pursed his lips when Tang behind him suddenly leaned forward, indignantly saying that he never saw a reaction. Gaoming mumbled quietly, looking at the elderly man. The scientist came close to him and asked if he didn't recognize him. He only responded by pointing his finger at him and laughing quietly, saying that he definitely couldn't be Tang Jiorui. Pulling back, he narrowed his eyes, continuing to laugh and say that this was some kind of joke. Pursing his lips, Tang fixed his gaze on him. Gaoming froze and his eyes widened in surprise. The professor nodded quickly when asked if this was really a joke. An elderly man sat down on a bench, looking at the two people opposite him. Wally began to tell him that he could make a cicada turn from a larva into an adult in an instant, and could also make it return to its original form. He smiled softly and added that he could do the same with people, and then he asked if he was interested in knowing how long he had left to live. The young man froze with his mouth slightly open when Gaoming said that birth, old age, illness and death are the natural order of things, and if there is life, then there is also death. He added that in his life he has never regretted anything and believes that life should develop naturally. Looking at his gloomy silhouette, Mr. Lu thought that he obviously didn't think at all like he said. The old man turned his head in his direction, puzzled. Mr. Lu slightly raised the corners of his mouth, saying that he wanted to be frank. He said that he has an eternal club and he needs an authoritative ecologist like him. He said that his job would be too. Gaoming froze, looking at him from under his brows, while the guy said that his job would be to create a completely new microscopic world together with Mr. Tang. Imagining the globe in his head, Lu Lai thought that the Eternal Club currently has a goal for the future, and this is the creation of a microworld. Then he remembered Messrs. Anthony and Tang, thinking that the titans of science would take part in this. He reflected that the theory had already taken shape, so it was time to take on the implementation of the Genesis plan. Squinting his eyes, Mr. Lu grinned and said that he would like to ask Gaoming to take responsibility for researching the ecological environment of the microworld. He imagined a small planet reading above his open palm and thought that the new ecological environment should be as perfect as the real world. Every biological chain should intersect. He reflected that the shape of the food chain should be as suitable as possible for evolution person. He thought that an ecologist creates the world, a geneticist creates life, and he can help bring everything to fruition. Gaoming looked at him with slightly surprised eyes, freezing and opening his mouth when the guy asked him to join them and said that he had a chance to create the world with his own hands. He asked about ready to seize this chance. The ecologist rose from the bench and stood opposite the men. He said his research area is mainly in plant ecology and animal ecology. He said that he may seem self-critical, but the old man closed his eyes and said that his achievements are far from enough, however, if he needs to reproduce the evolutionary process of the ecology of the earth with his own hands. Glancing at the men, he said that watching the stormy the growth of evolution and all similar processes. Tang and Lu Lai remained silent with satisfied faces when he added that he would like to get comfortable first. Tang looked at his boss's profile, reminding him that the lab was secret. Mr. Liu, flashing his glasses, smiled and said that everything was fine. The professor was very surprised by such a reaction, and while Gaoming looked at him with surprised eyes, he wondered whether the boss really agreed without any doubts. The young man put his hands in his pockets, and the corner of his lips turned up. He said that since Mr. Gaoming had not yet accepted the gift of time, he should be honest with him. Shanghai, high-tech zone. Waiwen stood in the spacious, bright room with her hands folded on her stomach. She noted that everything was ready. Lu Lai walked up to the girl and smiled, thanking her for her hard work, and then said that he had made an emergency decision. The girl responded by asking if he. The two of them turned around with puzzled faces when a loud shout came from the side, asking them to wait. Waiwen froze with wide eyes, looking at the short, laughing old man who ran into the room. Gaoming walked around the girl on both sides, examining her with a gaze and loudly expressing his sincere surprise. Looking at Lu Lai, he pointed his finger at Waiwen and asked with a stunned look if she was also working with them. The wide-eyed old man wondered when Mr. Liu smiled and said that Eternal Club is constantly attracting talented people, and more like-minded people will join them in the future. Gaoming looked at the girl again, and then remembered the image of Tang he met earlier. He thought about the fact that first he saw this resurrected man, and now also Waiwen. The old man froze with wide eyes, looking at the satisfied Lu Lai, and beads of sweat flowed down his face. He wondered whether there really was an organization for which these dates were willing to work. Finding herself on the street after a while, Waiwen stood next to the ecologist and waved her hand to the side. She said the lab was right in front of him. Gaoming froze with shock in his eyes. He saw in front of him a huge multi-story building, consisting of several buildings with offices and an area for conducting experiments. Waiwen noted that this might become his new place of work. The environmentalist enthusiastically noted that this building was very large, and then asked whether Mr. S family even knew. Liu, how much money did he spend on this? The girl took him inside the laboratory and led him along bright corridors that looked like the inside of a spaceship. She said that as far as she knew, it was all thanks to Mr. S connections. Liu. Gaoming asked if he did it all himself. Waiwen turned towards the old man and said that the most important thing he pays attention to is talent, since it is important for him that there is demand. When the large door to the medical room began to open, she added that then he would get what he wanted, having overcome all the difficulties. When the door opened completely, the ecologist froze, seeing in front of him a room with a high ceiling, which was littered with vegetation. His eyes narrowed and sweat ran down his cheek as he began to wonder whether there really were such high-ranking laboratories in the country. The old man turned away and folded his hands on his chest, closing his eyes. He noted that this was, roughly speaking, a huge room with many plants, and then added that it would be quite suitable for the amusement of amateurs. The elderly man turned around in surprise when a familiar voice came from the side, asking him not to be so superficial. Walking down the corridor, Tang walked towards them with a satisfied grin on his face. He said they modeled natural light, humidity levels, wind speeds. He noted that it can be said that this is an ecological model of the world. Looking back and peering at the dark silhouette of the boss, the man added that only Mr. can provide the most important things. Liu. The ecologist gave the guy a puzzled look. His eyes widened in surprise as the young man pulled out his golden pocket watch and grinned, activating a 1,000-fold acceleration of time. A golden light began to appear around the long green vine, and the fading flowers began to look fresh again. The vegetation was rapidly heading upward, almost reaching the high ceiling of the room. Seeing the clock face sitting, Lu Lai ordered him to stop. The ecologist stood with his head held high and his eyes wide open. Touching with his hand first the green stems and then the hard bark, he thought that this was simply incredible. He thought that now everything was visible to the naked eye, and since then during the incident with the cicada he was skeptical. Now, Gaoming lowered his head and literally looked into emptiness, and sweat flowed down his face. He began to think that if it was possible to expand this part of the forest to the whole continent, and then to the whole world. The old man's lips began to tremble. He imagined in his head a picture of himself running across a huge green leaf with a long red ribbon. The ecologist rejoiced at the revival of the global ecological environment and the fundamental solution to the world's environmental problems. Raising his head up, he closed his eyes and smiled widely. A happy blush appeared on his face. The elderly man happily thought that his youth would return. Lu Lai watched as the old man stood surrounded by green vines and stroked his face lustfully. While the guy and Waiwen standing next to him were shocked by such a sight, Tang, who was standing in the distance, quietly chuckled. He said that this is normal for him and that he has always been like this. Gaoming addressed Lu Lai by name, noting that he was not yet mature enough to communicate with him in a presentable manner. The old man opened his mouth and asked him to repeat again. Who does he need to create a new world? Squinting his cunning eyes, Mr. Lu grinned and said that he needed an ecologist. The older man chuckled quietly and then turned to the guy and said that in that case, he thought he would be perfect for the role. Lu sat in the office at a long table, while Gaoming sat at another table across from him. The guy said that the man only needs to sign this and he will become the 7th employee of the Eternal Club. The ecologist looked at the completed piece of paper that lay opposite him. Lu Lai said that he only needs to contribute to the club to receive employee points, and then he can exchange them for life expectancy. While the elderly man looked at the document, the guy with a smile on his face continued to say that although he does not need it, however, the body is the captain of the revolution. He said he didn't want him to end up holding a grudge. Daoming continued to remain silent while the guy continued to say that he, moreover, was taking on a huge project. The old man took a pen in his hand and began to write with it on a piece of paper. He said that he understood everything. When he jerked sharply while sitting on the chair, Mr. Lu grinned and said that this was his advance. With his eyes wide open in shock, the ecologist began to breathe heavily, thinking that he was experiencing a very amazing sensation. He thought that the fatigue had disappeared, and his legs and lower back seemed to be free of rust. The guy crossed his legs and put his hand on the table. He said that Mr. Gaoming was now part of his club, and at that moment the old man wondered whether this was really the peculiarity of the club's employees. Waiwen, who had been standing on the right side of the guy all this time, intervened in the conversation. He said that at the moment the Eternal Club is at the stage of secret development and is not subject to public disclosure. She said that in this regard he would have to give up his career as a video blogger and the attention of viewers. Lu Lai added that they would arrange everything for him later. The ecologist leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He said that he understood, and then added that pensioners are very bored, and at home you can only chat with the housekeeper. He said that she, however, does not understand anything at all about ecology, which prompted him to tell children about it on the internet. He added that he would leave his account to his ecology student, who enjoys doing this kind of stuff and is also funny. Gaoming closed his eyes and smiled, waving his hand. He said that now he has a project to create a new world, and he has no regrets. Lu Lai clasped his hands into a fist and placed them on his lap. He said that since this was the case, the old man could now start by creating the ecological environment of a miniature world. The environmentalist threw his hands over his shoulders and said that he simply could not wait for this. He leaned forward, looking at the guy with an interested gaze, and asked what ideas he had for creating that same world. Tapping his fingers on the table, Lu Lai lowered his eyes and said that he was not particularly versed in technology. However, starting is always difficult. He said that at first this world will be rough, but he pursues one single goal. The old man looked up at him in surprise when he said that all living beings in this new world. Leaning back in his chair, Mr. Lu grinned slyly, flashing his glasses, and said that they would become his time storage. After these words, the ecologist was shocked, and the guy continued to say that the dominant creature in this world should have low human intelligence and strong reproductive abilities. Lowering his head, he glanced at the old man from under his brows and added that also, high life expectancy. Gaoming looked at Mr. with a stunned look on his face. Lu, who adjusted his glasses and said that the lower the intelligence, the easier it is to carry out transactions. He said that it is necessary to reflect as closely as possible the causes and consequences of life and death on Earth for the continuous selection of the most suitable organism. The ecologist looked into the void with wide eyes, thinking that if this plan comes true, even if in miniature, however, ultimately it will be a world full of life. Imagining in his head a planet floating in space, he thought that this way of thinking is simply the most cruel and most rational for the ecology of the universe. He wondered if they in their world were not the same drop in the ocean in the eyes of the gods. With shocked eyes and a drop of sweat on his forehead, Gaoming continued to think that this Lu Lai's way of thinking has already been divorced from the way of thinking of ordinary people, and by creating the world with the help of time, he will become a creator. Imagining the image of Mr. in his head, Lu with his arms open, he thought that he would become the creator of the world. Looking at the guy, the ecologist said that all he needs to do is to develop and detail the evolution of this world. Presenting the watch dial, he said that he would then, using clever words, state the birth of civilization. The elderly man fell silent when asked what he thought. Sitting at the table and looking at the ecologist, Lu Lai argued about whether his concept was achievable. Gaoming remained silent and then imagined an asteroid in his head. Imagining the endless nature towards which the asteroid was rapidly flying, he replied that everything begins with the most cruel, with the most severe natural selection. An image of dinosaurs arose in his head, watching a bright flash. The asteroid fell to the ground. A moment later, there was a huge explosion, and the old man spoke about the mass extinction of species. The ecologist clasped his hands and put them on the table. He said that although they are able to simulate ideal plant ecology conditions inside the laboratory, however, to achieve the goal, a place with an extremely harsh environment is required. Lu Lai looked at him with a thoughtful look and touched his face with his hand. He asked, what then does the ecologist propose? The elderly man looked up at him and said that to create an ideal closed ecological environment, a place would be needed that would be much larger than this laboratory. Pursing his lips into stripes, Mr. Lu froze and thought that even if this is a miniature model that completely replicates the whole world, the laboratory alone will not be enough. The guy narrowed his eyes and grinned at one corner of his mouth. He approached Weiwen and said that their representatives abroad should start now. He said they needed a suitable location, noting that he didn't care how much it would cost. While he was laughing quietly, the girl looked at her boss and said that she understood him. Lu Lai sharply turned his gaze to her and asked how things were going with them. Weiwen turned to the guy and looked at him, saying that she constantly keeps in touch with Mr. Rong, and the other day he and Jikwin personally went to Thailand. While the plane was towering over the big city, she said that they were preparing to meet the King of Thailand, Marcus X. A large white plane touched the air with its wings. The voice said that Marcus is a person extremely greedy for power, and then asked how confident he is this time. While Jikwin looked at the head, Mr. Rong watched the view from the porthole window and said that the reason he chose him lies in the desire of all monarchs for longevity, and the desire to rule forever. Turning his gaze to his companion, the old man grinned and said that they could just give him this, and he was sure that it would not be difficult to convince him. Frowning his eyebrows, he looked to the side and said that it would be difficult to be in another, and then asked how they could take him with them. Jikwin put his hand on his knee and leaned forward. He said that this time he took with him reports about the recovery of the head and added that the facts should prompt him to action. Mr. Rong closed his eyes and said he hoped so. Pursing his lips, he looked out the porthole again and wondered whether the Mr. Base would succeed. Lu abroad. After a while, they arrived at a huge mansion that looked like a modern palace with bright orange accents decorated with gold. The black car drove into the estate's courtyard and then parked. A security guard dressed in a snow-white uniform approached the car. When the car door opened, an old man's foot stepped on the ground. After the two men left the salon, Mr. Rong raised his head and closed his eyes. He said that the last time he was here, he was still just a boy. He turned around when a voice from the side loudly asked how he was doing. An adult man in a bright yellow-orange cape ran out to them and opened his arms wide. Smiling, he laughed and greeted the head of the Rong family, noting that he looked very fresh. When Marcus approached the old man and shook his hand, he smiled back and congratulated him on his ascension to the throne, noting that he was a strong leader like his father. The man responded by saying that this time they would be able to remember the old days. Stepping back a little, he smiled broadly and said that his father had a very high opinion of Mr. Rong, because his family always fulfilled large orders and made huge profits. Jikwin and the head of the family bowed their heads in front of him, and the latter said that His Majesty was calling him back. Marcus pointed his hand at his house and asked him to forget about etiquette. He suggested we talk about everything in the living room. The old man grinned, thinking that the king had already realized that he had other intentions, and then agreed to his proposal. They entered one of the rooms of a huge white mansion, in the courtyard of which palm trees were planted. Marcus was sitting on a wide sofa, pointing at the table. He said it was swallow's nest soup and suggested Mr. Rong treat himself, saying that it is very good for the body. The elderly man took a deep white plate with a smile on his face. He noted that Thai swallow's nests are known all over the world. He cheerfully added that it looked like the decrepit old man would enjoy the delicacy today. The man opposite touched his chin with his hand and opened his mouth slightly. He said thoughtfully that he heard that Mr. Rong was seriously ill. He said that he was very worried, but could not do anything as he was busy with the accession to the throne. Raising a spoon of soup to his mouth, the old man grinned when the king, putting on a wide smile, said that such elderly people as they should take good care of his health. Marcus perked up when Mr. Rong turned to him. Throwing a multitasking glance at him, he smiled and asked what he thought he was in now. After this question, the man opposite twitched, and his eyes widened in surprise. Pursing his lips into a stripe, he thought that this was really strange, because as soon as he saw him, he immediately noticed that he looked too good for a man of his age. The elderly man put an empty cup of soup on the table. He noted that it was really tasty. Sitting comfortably on a wide sofa, he said that when you have been living in this world for several decades, it is rare to come across such delicacies. The king rolled his eyes, wondering how long they would continue to talk off topic. He asked Mr. Wrong, did he come to him to make a deal? The head of the family pulled the corners of his lips and said that His Majesty is very perceptive. He began to say that he had come here too. Marcus frowned when the old man gave him a predatory look and said with a stern grin that he had come to give him a gift. The king asked in confusion what did he mean. Mr. Wrong turned to Jiquen and asked him to bring everything he needed for review. The man in the suit picked up the tablet. Looking at Marcus's puzzled face, he came up and said that everything we needed was there. His Majesty silently took the gadget into his hands. When he placed it on the table, the device began recording. The voice asked Mr. Liu about how much his time is worth. The king, without hiding his surprise, looked at the video footage when the head of the Wrong family was dying. His relatives said that they were buying 1 year of life for their uncle. Marcus wondered what they were talking about. Without taking his eyes off the tablet, he wondered if he had heard right and were they really going to buy a year of life. The old man and his nephew watched His Majesty's reaction as the voice on the recording said that they all needed to hurry up as time was running out. A question hung in the king's eyes when he heard the words that what he had done was accomplished. He froze with shock in his eyes when he saw an unknown person on the screen and a bright white flash in the room, after which Mr. Wrong got out of bed. The young man in the plaid coat in the video said that Mr. Wrong truly deserves to be the head of the family, as his determination is simply amazing. Mekobo pursed his trembling lips when the unknown guy wished to enjoy this year of life. He wondered who this man was. Looking at His Majesty, Jiquen, as if reading his thoughts, answered the question that this is the path to immortality. The older man leaned forward, furrowing his brows and grinning at the same time. He asked the king if he understood this. The bright sun of Thailand illuminated the bright mansion with orange accents. A voice asked, what does time trader mean? Marcus looked at his guests puzzled and asked who Mr. Liu. Mr. Wrong leaned back on the sofa and said that at one time he paid a fortune and 1 year of his life to avoid death. He added that in order for his family to continue its great existence, he paid for the 2nd year. The old man frowned and said in a confident voice that this deal was absolutely profitable. Leaning forward a little, he said that the reason why life is precious is because the value of life itself cannot be measured in money. Looking intently at the elderly man, the king pursed his lips into a thin stripe and thought that this was true, because the price of immortality is equivalent to how many opportunities you can get. Mr. Wrong perked up when Marcus stood up from the sofa and turned half sideways towards him, frowning his eyebrows. He asked if the same person founded the Eternal Club. He added that his personal doctor could give the head a full examination, since unscientific statements can only be verified scientifically. The old man froze, and Jiquen smiled contentedly when His Majesty said that if everything was true. Throwing lightly at his guests with an incredulous look, Marcus said that in this case he would personally go to China to visit this Mr. Liu. At this time, the midday sun was shining through the windows of Liu Lai Mansion. Pressed against the wall with his back, the guy crossed his arms and looked at the contract lying on the table. He thought that Hu Gaoming is employee number 7. His personality type is ISTP, and he is a cold-blooded observer by nature and carefully observes and records through impartial curiosity. One day, the guy watched him work together with Tang and Anthony and how the old man indignantly poked at the professor. He was thinking about how this ecologist is one of humanity's top-notch scientists, and his current ability rating is 10 out of 10. He looked at Gaoming's photos of different hairstyles on his head after advising him to develop his imagination. Flashing his glasses, the young man frowned, lowering the corners of his lips, and thought about the day when he would reward the ideal system of the ecological environment, and the profession suitable for him would be the head of the Genesis project of the Eternal Club. Liu Lai smiled slightly, imagining the many small planets. He thought that perhaps one day he would have countless miniature worlds. He imagined one of them on his open palm and thought that the time would come when he would be able to use the universe as a chessboard. Imagining a golden watch dial above her, he grinned contentedly, holding his crossed arms on his chest. The guy thought that then all living beings would become his pawns. When the soft sound of footsteps was heard, a girl in a gray office skirt entered the office. Ignoring her, Liu Lai looked at one point, thinking that there had been no news from the Wrong family for several days. Frowning his eyebrows, he thought that Marcus was a very important person, and he hoped that everything went well. Weiwen came closer, holding the phone in her hand, and stopped. With a smile on her face, she turned to her boss and said that the Wrong family was calling him. Throwing a glance at her, the young man remained silent. Putting his cell phone to his ear, he answered the call. Weiwen stood silently and watched as Mr. Liu, closing his eyes, went to the large window. He asked how things were in Thailand, and then said that it meant that the king had doubts. Liu Lai lowered his eyes and was silent for a while, and then turned his gaze to the side and asked what he was told. The guy listened silently to the answer and then smiled slightly, noting that he understood everything. With his back to the girl and one hand in his pocket, he said that he wanted to meet him in person. When the boss ended the call, Waiwen smiled and noted that it seemed like Mr. Wrong did not disappoint his expectations. Flashing the lenses of his glasses, Lu Lai turned a sly glance at her and confidently said with a grin that the base abroad was in his pocket. Looking at him in response, the girl thought that they were not mistaken in choosing the Wrong family as a representative. The guy with a satisfied face sat down on the sofa and threw his arm over the back of the furniture. He said that the centuries-old heritage of the Wrong family is their best accumulation, and the King of Thailand is a very rare and excellent client. Raising his eyes to Waiwen, he said with a smile that in this regard, he couldn't wait to find out what kind of plan was brewing in his head for the overseas base. With her hands folded behind her back, the girl remained silent for a while, and then, presenting a map of the area, said that the tropical archipelago, where Thailand is located, has an extremely advantageous geographical position. In her head, she imagined the tropical islands from a bird's eye view and said that numerous private islands are under development, and with the help of the king, they can buy several for secret experiments. Presenting the equipped underground tunnels, the girl said that under his cities they can slowly build an underground base. The guy frowned and crossed his arms, comprehending her words, and Waiwen continued, drawing a picture of the metropolis in his head. She said that these are the so-called hidden cities, adding that in the future there will be tens of millions of people on the surface. Throwing a predatory glance at the boss from under her brows, the girl confidently said that they would be the best disguise for a secret base. Hearing this, Lu Lai looked at her with surprised eyes. Touching his chin with his fingers, the young man grinned contentedly and said that this sounded very good and he would need to think about this option. Lu Lai smiled contentedly when Waiwen came closer to him, and, looking down, said that then, while they were waiting for the king, they could. Adjusting his tie, the guy glanced at her and interrupted, saying that in this chess room they don't need to rush the game. There were a lot of people in a small cafe with simple tables and chairs. The men laughed drunkenly as they drank. They smoked right in the room. Many plates stood near the frying pan in which the greens were stewed. Old Man Rong came into the establishment with his assistant. Huan looked at the old man and asked if he should disperse the crowd from this place first. Rong laughed, thinking how delicious it smelled, and said that Mr. Liu is over 100 years old, he must like such simple establishments. The old man turned around with a smile, addressing Marcus X in a friendly manner and asked, he rarely eats in such places, even if he doesn't stand like a pillar, but walks. A man in a burgundy coat and dark glasses stood by a car flanked by 2 bodyguards and was expressively silent. He looked displeasedly at Mr. Rong and thought that he was mocking him. He looked down thoughtfully, reflecting that when they studied here together, he had never visited such garden establishments. Mr. Rong waved his hand, saying Mr. Liu is already here, we need to hurry, and the man thought that is this old man from a respected family in league with this time traitor. He frowned, thinking that if this was true, then he was not such a smart person. The company, led by an old man, walked between the rows of tables in the establishment. Lu Lai was sitting at one of the tables with a tray of food. He pulled pieces of food off the skewer with his teeth. Nodding, he turned to the others. He turned to Mr. Rong, saying that they had arrived, and the elder smiled and apologized for being late. Lu Lai looked at him, smiling and said that they were just in time, the kebab had just been brought. A ginger cat meowed loudly on the trash can. Marcus X sat opposite the others and was silent, with 2 guards standing behind him. The king frowned, thinking that this guy hadn't even prepared a speech. He saw the brunette discussing food with the old man. Frowning, the man with glasses thought that even if he didn't think about it, he was a king. Suddenly everyone turned to the man who approached and asked if they were now in full force. A fat waiter in a t-shirt with a cigarette in his mouth held a notepad and said that they should not say that he was driving, because his drink deserves attention. Quan, who was standing behind the old man, looked at him and said that they had gathered to discuss matters, could he please, but he was immediately interrupted. The waiter with a sharp movement threw his notepad on the table and shouted that this couldn't be done. He looked at the stern bodyguards in black glasses and said that they thought he didn't know what they were doing here. Only just yesterday 5 girls came to record mukbang. He emotionally said that he cooks everything himself, but there is no profit, do they understand? Seemingly decent people give everyone barbecue, they want him to go broke. Quan exhaled, wondering how this could happen, and the owner of the establishment shouted that all the profit rests only on alcohol, either let them order drinks, or let them go to another place, and there is no need to push them around. Mr. Rong smiled at the man, telling him to bring him 4 mugs of beer, 2 at room temperature and 2 chilled. The specialties are very good, and if they don't finish eating, they will take them with them, and Lu Lai, who was chewing next to him, added that he would pay for everything. Marcus X frowned at this scene, thinking that he had forgotten, and the owner of the establishment accepted the order and asked to wait a little. Unable to bear it, the king took off his glasses and told Lu Lai that he did not understand at all what was happening and hoped that he would be able to explain to him. Lu Lai extended his hand with folded fingers and spoke of time slowing down 1,000 times. There was a loud snap of fingers. A large golden dial appeared in the air. Everyone present in the cafe froze, covered in a black and white time change filter. Marcus X jumped to his feet, not understanding what had happened. His guards spread their arms, covering the master. The man looked at everyone in shock. People froze and did not move, and the man asked, "Did all the people around freeze?" He turned to the guy who called out to him. Lu Lai sat smiling and said to His Majesty, "Welcome to his temporary field." Marcus X looked at him in shock, thinking that this was just crazy. The owner of the establishment had just literally hung in the air, but this was definitely not some kind of trick. Lu Lai took the glass and said that they had something to discuss. The king listened to a guy who said that the great hermit lived in the city and the simple one lived in the village. The guy closed his eyes, saying that in other words, if you want to hide something. Among the frozen visitors of the cafe, only the table was not covered with a time change filter. The guy continued that it was necessary to hide it in the most visible place. He looked at the man and confidently continued that, for example, under the city. Marcus X looked at him in surprise. Then he smiled and asked if he really wanted to build a building right under one of his cities. Lu Lai nodded, closing his eyes and said, "Of course, he is the king, he personally has unlimited wealth." Then he opened his eyes and asked, "But that's what he's limited to, right?" The guy continued that they both don't have enough money to buy the things they want. The king listened attentively, looking at him. He was amazed to hear that the guy could make his future last. He looked at the man insidiously, saying that this included power. The king opened his eyes in surprise. The guy stood up, folded his hands on his chest, and confidently declared that the price he was offering was immortality. Lu Lai smiled insidiously, saying that immortality is the price he can offer. The king looked at him silently, pondering the proposal. Marcus X closed his eyes and said that it was very tempting, but he was the king. Looking confidently and placing his hands on his hips, he continued that he could not ignore the opinion of his people and the guy must understand this. Lu Lai leaned his head on his hand and grinned, saying that their cooperation with the king would not be limited to just buying land. The sound of thin heels was heard throughout the establishment. The guy said that the Eternal Club attracts talents from all over the world. The girl walked holding a blue folder in her hands, and he said that talents and technologies would help them take social development to a new stage. A girl in a skirt walked towards them. The guy said that with the help of foreign bases they would be able to complete various kinds of experiments, and by that time the pharmaceutical factory would reach the international level. Waiwen approached the guy, saying that she brought everything, and Lu Lai praised her for her excellent job. Marcus X looked at them in surprise. A thick blue folder appeared on the table in front of him and the brunette asked him to look through it. The man looked in surprise at the papers he held in his hands. Lu Lai smiled confidently, saying that this is just the first step towards the implementation of their master plan, but in practice, the scale will of course be much larger. He looked carefully at his interlocutor, asking what he thought. This is an opportunity for new jobs, as well as for fulfilling large foreign orders, a good addition to their cooperation, isn't it? Marcus X remained silent, carefully reading the information in his hands. He was silent, thinking about it. Then he smiled and nodded, saying that since that was the case, they would need to discuss everything in detail. He started to say that he didn't know, but the guy raised his hand to stop him and sneezed loudly, then apologized. Clearing his throat, he pointed to the woman standing next to him and said that he could contact Waiwen for details. Such issues should be resolved by professionals, right? The king's bodyguards looked at each other, thinking that such geniuses exist. Lu Lai looked at the woman with his hand on the table and told her to bring the contract. Mr. Rong looked at the guy and whispered excitedly that the gentleman should not rush into the agreement. The old man said that now they had come to an agreement with him verbally. In his experience, discussing such things in a hurry does not end with anything good. Lu Lai smiled widely as he looked at him and said that he was definitely saying reasonable things. Waiwen brought the contract, and the guy pushed the sheet towards the surprised old man, saying that, however, this contract was intended for him. The gray-haired man looked at the text on the form. Taking it in his hand, he read that the price for 3 years is 0. His eyes widened in surprise. Lu Lai looked at him with a smile and said that Mr. Rong performed very well and can consider this a reward for the work he has done. The old man shouted to Quan to give him a pen, to which the man quickly reached for his inner pocket. Marcus X looked at them in shock, not understanding what was happening. Mr. Rong signed his name in the corner of the page, saying that 3 years would be enough for his physical condition to enter a new phase. Mr. Rong adjusted his glasses. Gold glowing dials appeared around him. He said that the deal had been completed. The man leaned over, closing his eyes. Suddenly a glow appeared around him, the wrinkles on his face, forehead and lips smoothed out, and he immediately began to look much younger. Marcus X jumped to his feet, amazed by what he saw. Mr. Rong looked much younger even from the back. The king looked at him, his mouth open in surprise, and thought that the man had become younger. He grinned, thinking that was great. The man clenched his fist, thinking that stopping time was still in doubt. He looked at them carefully, thinking hard, and thought that the rejuvenation of the head of the wrong family left no questions. Lu Lai sat relaxed. Behind him was the image of a white and gold antique watch. The man thought, looking at him, that this is a miracle. This man has divine power. Lu Lai looked at the king smiling. The king nodded to himself and looked at him, thinking that he would definitely make a deal with him. The cafe patrons present had returned to their own time and were noisy with conversation and food. Mr. Wrong laughed, glad that he was younger, and told Quan to bring more drinks. The man looked at him worriedly, asking, but what about his health? The head of the family was warming up, bending over with his arm outstretched, and said that it was okay. Besides, he had an appetite. He should definitely get drunk with Mr. Liu, and thought I was ready to drink a whole box. Marcus X applauded. He smiled widely, spreading his arms, and said that today it was a revelation for him. Who else would have the chance to see this? Lu Lai shook his head, smiling, and told the king that it was nothing. The man, smiling broadly, ordered his bodyguard to go find the owner of the establishment and say that he was lucky today. He was going to honor Mr. Liu. The man thought that he seemed to have met a great friend today. Lu Lai looked at him confidently, saying that obedience is the best sign of respect, and he himself thought that he had succeeded. A loud cry of Mr. could be heard from the establishment. Wrong, who demanded to bring him more drinks, and the excited words of Quan, who asked him to slow down and offered his help, to which the old man laughed and said how long he had wanted to try this. Continuous loud laughter echoed along the street. It was already dark outside, and the neon sign outside the establishment turned on. There were many empty plates and alcohol bottles on the table. Marcus X shook Lu Lai's hand. The rest of the company stood around them. The king thanked the guy for his hospitality and said that he was very impressed by this meeting. The king smiled widely and said that the dishes were top-notch, as was Waiwen's eloquence. The guy is truly surrounded by talented people. The woman smiled, bowed her head, and said that His Majesty would praise her. They would certainly look forward to close cooperation with the king's country. Marcus X smiled and looked at the guy and said that it was mutual. Lu Lai looked at him silently and smiled back. Suddenly they turned to the side, hearing one of the visitors swearing, calling them old rubbish, and asking how she brought food. Two bald men sat at one of the tables, one of whom shouted at the elderly waitress that he had oil all over his face, to which she apologized in fear. She extended her hand, making excuses that it wasn't on purpose, but the bald man shouted, asking that she wanted to piss him off. Lu Lai silently watched the scene unfold. Marcus X, looking there, asked what was the matter, but Mr. Wrong apologized that he had to see this and promised that he would deal with it right away. The bald men turned around when they heard the girl say that it didn't work out well and she apologizes for her colleague. Lu Lai looked surprised. A girl with her hair braided on both sides in a waitress uniform was walking towards the table. The men looked at her carefully. One of them asked why such beauties work in such a diner. The woman in surprise called out her name Yuki, and the girl confidently blocked her with herself and said that they would not bother them anymore. She would just pay their bill and ask for an apology. Would that be okay? The man asked, will he pay? He turned to her sternly and asked if she thought they were unable to pay for the food. The girl remained silent excitedly. The head waitress waved her hands, coming forward, and said that it was her own fault, and the girl here was just working part-time. It was completely her fault. The men looked at her angrily. The woman fell silent in fear. One of the men grinned, saying that so be it, it's just a trifle, everyone can make mistakes. He looked sternly, adding that he would like the girl whom he called a wench to have a glass with them, then they would completely forget the mistake of the stupid old woman. The girl listened to this in amazement, and the man giggled disgustingly. Yuki lowered her head, saying that she could drink alcohol if they calmed down, and everyone was happy. The woman covered her mouth with her hand in fear, thinking that she wouldn't do anything. They were bastards. The girl's gaze flashed with anger, and she continued that she saw right through them and called them dirty animals. The men fell silent in shock and surprise. Lu Lai smiled and chuckled contentedly. The bald ones got angry, shouting that they had made concessions to her. She was mocking her and they would beat her now. Mr. Wrong turned to his assistant, who answered yes, ready to stand up for the girl. Quan turned around after hearing the words that this was not necessary. Lu Lai smiled, and Waiwen assured Mr. Wrong that he doesn't need to worry. Lu Lai chuckled as he looked at her. The woman looked at the boss and continued that this girl will not get hurt today. Yuki looked at the offenders sternly, clenching her fists, shouting that it was a free account or nothing. The men screamed, wishing her death. The girl bit her lip and thought about a plan of action, a counterattack and a blow to the jaw. The men with a fierce look clenched their fists and ran towards the girl. She closed her eyes in fear, telling herself that she could do it. Lu Lai, looking at her, applied a 50-fold acceleration of time. Yuki screamed. The men grinned, saying that she thought that, but did not have time to continue. A powerful blow landed right in the nose of one of them. The second looked at it in surprise. The man flew far forward between the rows of tables and fell to the floor with a crash. Chairs fell and were swept away by the shock wave and landed on the floor. The man opened his mouth, missing teeth, and lay beaten and covered in blood. The second man looked at him in shock, not understanding what was happening. Suddenly a fist flashed in front of his face. From the force of the blow to the jaw, the second man flew high into the air. He even had a tooth knocked out. Yuki was very surprised by all this. All visitors to the cafe, including the guy and his partners, silently watched this fight. The man was lying on the ground. The girl looked at her hands in surprise, thinking that it was strange. Were they so weak or was she so strong? Lu Lai grinned as he looked at her. It was dark outside. Not only the sign of the establishment was on, but also the lights in many of the windows. The visitors stood up from their seats, looking at the girl in shock, and thought, what happened? The girl beat up two thugs. Is it true? Was it a setup? The head waitress looked at Yuki in surprise, asking if she was okay, to which the girl confidently placed her hands on her hips, laughed and said that she was okay. Recently she had been practicing freestyle fighting, and the woman asked her again, what recently? The men were lying on the floor, badly beaten. The girl, pleased with herself, smiled and said that she thought that they just liked to mock the weak. They looked formidable, but in reality they were absolutely helpless. The woman answered her that in any case, she was still very young and she should be more careful, and the girl giggled to herself and told her not to worry. Lu Lai, turning slightly, watched their dialogue. In the yellow building of the Eternal Club headquarters, Lu Lai sat at the desk in his office and read the paper in his hand, humming. There was information about the girl. In the photo there was a woman, next to whom were two little girls, and in the other, Yuki herself, who was touching her glasses with her hand. The guy read that her name is Shen Yuki. She is 26 years old and comes from Sichuan province, grew up with her grandmother and two younger sisters, has a reserved and firm character. The girl is an employee of the city's Hope Rising enterprise and receives a monthly salary of 12,000. Robert was sitting on the sofa and eating kebabs, and Peng came up from behind and, leaning on the back of the sofa, asked who bought the kebabs, to which he received the answer that Yan Yu. And what? Lu Lai read the information that in order to provide for the family, he does part-time work with an hourly wage. Peng looked askance at the blonde who was chewing diligently and asked why he was eating them so joyfully as if they were bought for him alone. The blonde, without stopping chewing, said that if he was jealous, then let him say so, should he really feed him. Lu Lai was surprised to see that the information was over and asked again, is that all? So little. Peng, with a kebab in his hand, sat next to Robert, who had fallen asleep on the sofa and, turning to the gentleman, replied that this was all the information that could be obtained. There was nothing special. The guy thought that he was very tired and hungry. Lu Lai looked at the papers, saying that everything was indeed completely normal. Peng looked at the boss, stopping chewing when he heard that he would have to disturb him again, to which he replied that there was no problem. Lu Lai stood near the table, adjusting his glasses, and told the guy to go and buy a gift suitable for the girl, to which the security officer asked in surprise what he was doing. He looked confused, listening to the instructions that you need to approach this carefully. You need to create a sense of surprise. You don't need to overdo it, but you don't need to be modest either. In general, the guy will figure it out on his own. He turned to his boss, inspired by the idea of giving a military shovel, a very practical thing, but was refused. Lu Lai approached him and said that so that he would not embarrass himself, he had better consult with someone, and the guy, sulking, thought about why he did not like the military shovel. Rubbing his chin, the guy thought about who he could consult with, and the image of Yan Yu appeared in his head. Lu Lai silently looked at Peng, who exclaimed that the boss would rely on him and believed that everything had already been done. The guy ran out of the room, and the brunette shouted after him so that they wouldn't say it was from him. Lu Lai looked after him gloomily and thought that he did not expect that Peng would have such problems with this. With his hands folded across his chest, the guy turned to the blonde and asked how the job he entrusted him with was going. Robert was sleeping with his arms and legs spread out on the sofa and his mouth wide open. Lu Lai called him by name. The guy woke up with a grunt and asked incomprehensibly, who? Lu Lai sat down on the sofa opposite and asked how things were going with Zhao Dahua and his squad. Robert grimaced, stretching his neck, and thought how he could fall asleep. It looks like he was lying on his neck. And he answered out loud that he was helping Instructor Zhang, accompanied by their squad. Let the guy get ready to hear the result of the month. Robert looked at the guy and said that they combed every corner of the world and tried their best on transactions. An image of men in coats and hats, like special agents, appeared in my head, and the guy continued that they behaved very carefully and did not attract too much attention. Lu Lai smiled contentedly, saying that it was not bad and that everything seemed to go quite well. Robert, looking at him, said that in fact they had already returned and were ready to report everything to him. Lu Lai was surprised, thinking that they had already returned, which means they managed it faster than he expected. He rubbed his chin with his fingers, saying that he wanted to meet them, and he thought that he was looking forward to Universal Time. 3 men were driving in a car, and meanwhile the guy was thinking, I wonder what it would be like to hold him in your hands. A car drove up to the main entrance of the building. Yan Yu came out onto the porch in a yellow dress and said that great job, and the gentleman was already waiting for them. The men followed the man in the hat. Lu Lai stood at his desk in the office and looked at the girl. Yanyu, clasping her hands behind her back, said that the guarantors were already here. Lu Lai smiled, saying let them come in. With a stomp, the men entered the office. They stood in front of the table and the man, who had already taken off his hat, said that they were back. Lu Lai said it was great as he looked at them, a golden dial flickering in his eyes. Red inscriptions appeared above the men. The man with long ponytailed hair was named Dahua, age 46 years old, 23 years, 10 months, 18 days, 23 hours, 30 seconds to live. In parentheses below the information appeared that he had 1603 years. The man with the mustache who took off his hat was called Bayashan. He was 55 years old. The remaining time was 8 years, 7 months, 14 days, 9 hours, 13 seconds. He had 1580 years. The third man with short hair was named Zai. He was 40 years old, had 32 years, 8 months, 23 days, 15 hours, 22 seconds to live, and had a year of 1821. Lu Lai smiled widely, saying, "What does it look like?" He looked at the men and continued that this is the time received by the guarantor. Lu Lai sat in a chair that was like a throne with a round back and said that they had done a great job. The men looked at him, red inscriptions glowing above them with information about the duration of their remaining life and the time received. Bayashan thought that he was feeling the pressure again and said that they had come to report the results from the work. Lu Lai looked at them carefully, analyzing that this last line of numbers must be the result of their transactions. The guarantors looked at the gentleman seriously. Lu Lai grinned and noted that it seems that their agreement with him does not allow men to use this time, it can only be transferred to him. This is wonderful. He looked at the red inscriptions and thought that judging by the amount of time collected per month, the daily income of each of them was more than 50 years. The guy grinned, thinking that they really had no equal in deals. He looked at the man with the scar on his face and thought that Zai had a lot more time than the others. With his lips slightly curved in a grin, the guy looked at the man and, analyzing, thought that according to his assessment of his personality, human life is indifferent to him and he enjoys any manifestation of struggle. He is truly a cruel person. The men were worried, thinking that for the strange silence, he was not happy with them, and Lu Lai at that time thought that there were no weak ones among them. Otherwise they would not have been able to collect 5,000 years in such a short time. The men were surprised to hear the guy say that they were worthy of praise. Looking at them, he clarified, did they leave no traces? Zai, looking at the boss, replied that he needn't worry, they acted extremely secretly and, moreover, the people who had made deals with them for years did not want any extra trouble for themselves. The guy sitting at the table said it was good. He was very pleased with them. Lu Lai grinned wickedly, his glasses flashing. He looked at the men and said that then now he can take all this time. He extended his hand forward. The men looked at him in surprise. Suddenly they were engulfed in a blinding golden flash. Lu Lai's eyes glowed golden as he used the power of time manipulation. The guarantors writhed, as if golden bolts of lightning were spreading through their bodies. Bright curls of time rushed to the center of the palm of the Lord of Time. The golden shining ball seemed to contain a white-hot dial. The guy folded his palms, forming a golden ball of time between them. The numbers in the inscription changed rapidly. With a rustle, the time value changed. A red inscription with his name Lu Lai appeared above the guy himself, which reported that his name was Lu Lai. He was 27 years old. He had 29 years, 89 days, 21 hours, 3 minutes and 55 seconds left to live. The brunette spread his arms to the sides, dials hovered around him, a red inscription above him, and a bright halo seemed to appear above his head. He looked forward, listening to his feelings, and thought that this was it, this feeling when he had more than 5,000 years in his hands. Bayashan looked at the gentleman excitedly and asked if he was okay. The guy did not answer, smiling greedily, but he himself thought, what does this huge number mean? He clenched his fist, thinking that even if he gave up everything, he would continue to live. Silhouettes of historical figures appeared in my head, then a bird's eye view of the city and then houses from above. The guy looked seriously and thought that the history of China goes back about 5,000 years. Some 2,000 have passed since the beginning of our era. In the following millennia he could become immortal, who would observe the rise and fall of civilizations. Now his remaining life exceeded 5,000 years. The golden pocket watch began to glow and sway. The guy listened to the sensations and thought that his abilities were again having some strange reaction. Lu Lai stretched out his hand, looking at his watch, and asked himself, what could it be? The arrow of the Rhone was spinning so quickly that it could not even be noticed. The clock shone brightly. Their radiance was so bright that the guy closed his eyes, hiding his eyes. He stood there, narrowing his eyes. Then he slowly opened his eyes, and then he opened them in shock. The brunette seemed to be floating in a space consisting of landscapes of space, the universe and golden dials around, and thought that here is the heart of time. He landed on the dial, like a path located under his feet, and a bright circle appeared from his stomping. He walked forward and thought it was amazing. Suddenly he stopped and looked ahead in shock. In front of him stood a stone statue holding a large stone sundial with many symbols on the dial. He opened his eyes in surprise and thought, is this a sundial? He examined the hieroglyphs written on the stone and asked himself what was the matter. Then he fell silent, realizing. The guy nodded, smiling, said that these are the laws of time. It seems he understood. Maybe he can see everything for himself. He smiled insidiously, thinking that it was not only the future. The look was full of awareness that the past was also available to him. The guarantors stood quietly in front of the guy and could not understand what was happening. Someone said that they could not squeeze out a word. Someone whispered that he was not angry. Maybe it's worth asking him. The guy stood in front of them with his eyes closed, not hearing the man's whisper that he was telling the eldest among them to ask. Bayoshan got ready and began to say the guy's name. Suddenly, Lu Lai exhaled a long breath. The guy opened his eyes, calmly looking at the men. The employees stared at him in surprise, thinking that he had woken up. Lu Lai sat down in the chair at his desk and nodded with a smile and said that everyone had done their job well. He would reward them as promised. Dahua bowed and chuckled embarrassedly, telling the guy not to rush. It was an honor for them to work with him. Lu Lai looked at them, continuing that the first thing he wanted to do was warn the men. They listened excitedly to the words about what if they said something to someone that they shouldn't say after leaving this room. The brunette frowned at them and warned that then he would not stand on ceremony with anyone. The men bowed deeply to the master, agreeing. Then they left the office. Lu Lai looked after him seriously, thinking that the power of time and its laws had strengthened. He bowed his head, thinking that although he could control time, when did he enter that illusory space? He remembered floating, surrounded by a golden glow. A memory of him looking at the stone sundial arose in his mind, and he continued to think that when he saw that thing, he was extremely shocked. The guy's hand reached out to the stone clock. When he touched them, the space was illuminated by a bright golden glow, spreading like rays from the clock. The guy closed his eyes and pulled back. He looked at the greenish shining line of stars that appeared above his head. He looked at her in amazement and thought that this is the time. Yes, he feels that this is it. Green stars curled, running forward. The guy thought that he was not mistaken. This must be his incarnation. The radiance united into a green path, consisting as if of constellations, and the guy realized that this was the river of time. He stared in amazement, thinking that it was amazing. In the river of humanity's time many great events were hidden. He threw back his head, surrounded by a green glow, thinking that it was an amazing feeling, as if by stepping into this river he would cross the boundaries of ancient and modern times, wandering between different periods. He extended his hand to the river of time. His eyes widened in surprise. Suddenly he seemed to be surrounded by an unknown radiance, looking around in fear. Gold-colored grains surrounded his palm, curling around his hand, and he thought it felt like time was going backwards. The green vortices united, forming a vortex similar to the universe. He tried to stretch out his hand, wondering why he was being pulled in. Lu Lai leaned over, trying to get out, thinking how much he felt bad. While trying to remove his hand with his other hand, he noticed something, surprised. The numbers in its red inscription changed rapidly. With a rustling sound, the remaining time changed and was consumed. He looked scared, shouting that no. Trying to stick his hand out, he screamed for it to stop. Finally, stretching out his hand with force, he jumped away from the bright radiance. He breathed heavily, aware that he had almost been swallowed up. A white ball shone like a halo above the guy's head. He thought that it seemed like returning to the past wasted time. The red inscription said that Lu Lai, who is 27 years old, has 5720 years, 89 days, 18 hours, 3 minutes, 1 second left to live. The guy realized that almost 10 years have been used up, which means traveling to the past wastes much more than a room of time. Lu Lai stood at the window, reminiscing, and analyzed that the laws of time must be treated with trepidation since they are ruthless and cruel. He frowned, crossing his arms over his chest. In his pocket, a gold pocket watch seemed to glow brightly, and the guy thought that it spared no one, not even him. The brunette imagined the stone dial of an ancient sundial and thought that the further one goes into the past, the more time is spent. There was an hourglass with blue sand inside on the table. The guy thought that as for the consumption of the amount of time, it still needs to be explored. The hero lowered his head, closed his eyes, and continued thinking that in addition, you need to be careful with changes in history. If change it, then it may disappear completely. Looking out the window at the city panorama, he thought that today he might not see the sun again. The guy opened his eyes, thinking that it was very dangerous. Then he remained silent, and then he smiled, asking himself, which was very exciting, wasn't it? He put his hands behind his head, thinking that who knows, maybe he would meet great figures. The sun's rays reflected in the windows of a high-rise business center building. Employees in formal suits walked along the corridor. Peng, dressed as a delivery man, carried a box in his hand as beads of sweat ran down his face. The guy frowned and adjusted his black cap with a red trim, asking himself how delivering packages could be so difficult. Looking ahead with determination, he told himself that he could handle it. Peng flinched in fright, almost dropping the package when he suddenly heard a woman's voice asking if he was looking for someone. A girl in a white blouse with dark hair braided in 2 braids smiled politely, asked if everything was fine with him, and said that strangers were not allowed here. Turning to her, Peng said that he was delivering food. Smiling awkwardly, the guy showed the box he was holding in his hands and said that he meant that he was delivering goods to Yuki. The girl, covering her mouth with her hand, laughed, asking if the guy was working for the first day because he was very excited, and said that everything was fine and she didn't bite. Wang turned her head when she heard herself being addressed, saying that Director Zhang would be negotiating with Director Li at the restaurant on the ground floor at 11 o'clock. A bespectacled girl with dark long hair tied in 2 ponytails, holding a thick blue folder with materials for the conference, tilted her head in surprise when Wang said that she was just in time because the package was for her. Peng looked intensely from under his cap at Yuki. The girl picked up the